Bonjour à tous, soyez les bienvenus pour cette nouvelle émission des entretiens de lycépiens. Nous accueillons aujourd'hui Monsieur Patric Deneen, professeur de sciences politiques à l'Université Notre-Dame aux États-Unis, où il dirige la chaire d'études constitutionnelles et représente l'aile conservatrice des intellectuels conservateurs américains. Son dernier ouvrage, Pourquoi le libéralisme a échoué, retranscrit son analyse brillante de la situation politique occidentale actuelle et fait de lui l'un des théoriciens politiques les plus écoutés outre-Atlantique. Welcome, Mr. Deneen. Thank you for accepting our invitation for our newly established ESEP Student Media Channel. I am Magellan, and this is my classmate Jules. We are very grateful that you could be our guest for this interview, where we are going to talk about your brilliant essay on why liberalism failed, which is actually a very topical issue. First of all, for our listeners who perhaps don't know you here in France, could you just tell us a few words about yourself, your experience, and what is your interest in the questions related to liberalism?
Yes, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure. I had hoped that I could visit you in person, but perhaps we can do that some later time. My field of study is political philosophy, so a field with deep French connections, with authors such as Montesquieu, Rousseau, Tocqueville, and perhaps especially for me, Tocqueville, the great French analyst of modern democracy, was in some ways my inspiration for this book. What Tocqueville does in his book, Démocratie de la démocratie en Amérique, is to analyze the internal logic of democracy, not necessarily what he sees at that moment, but what he foresees, what he sees its tendencies, its proclivities. And so he in some ways engages in a kind of prophecy, but also just a kind of analysis where he follows the logic of the political dynamics. And I think in the book that you mentioned, I try to imitate Tocqueville, thinking about the phenomenon of liberalism, which certainly after the Second World War has become the dominant political order of Western society.
Yes, exactly. And to begin with, actually, because your book is about liberalism, could you just give us a definition of liberalism and what does one have to understand about liberalism?
One way of thinking about it was actually described by Tocqueville in a chapter in which he discusses democracy's affection for both equality and liberty. And he describes modern democracy, and I think he's talking really about liberalism or liberal democracy, as a kind of an attraction to both equality and liberty, or the way that they blend to we could say a condition of equal liberty, equal freedom, to be equally free. Liberalism in some ways divides between two parties naturally, and Tocqueville recognizes this. There will be a party of liberty, and in the liberal tradition, you could say this is associated with the classical liberal tradition. We might think of someone like John Locke or the American founding fathers. And it's the definition of liberty or liberalism that might predominate in the French understanding. When a French or European hears the word liberalism, I think this is what one hears. It's the tradition of classical liberalism. So the emphasis is upon liberty, and in particular, the equal opportunity of every individual to enjoy the freedom to pursue their own idea of the good, their own vision of what their life should be like. The emphasis tends to be more on the role of the market in securing the goods of the individual rather than the state. There's another party of liberalism, and in the United States, we call that progressive liberalism, or it might be in France or in Europe, it might be described more as social democracy. So you may not call it liberalism, but in the tradition of liberalism, it's a variant or a version of liberalism. And this emphasizes equality. But equality now is especially the condition in which we have the assistance, especially of the state, to provide us the conditions of equal liberty. So in some ways you could say the aim is the same. the condition of equal liberty, the enjoyment and pursuit of the goods that we think individually constitute our happiness. The difference tends to be over the means, whether the emphasis is more on the market or the emphasis is more on the role of the state and public policy.
Well, before going any further and to fully understand your reasoning, I think we need to review some historical events. I mean, you highlight two fundamental revolutions of liberalism in thinking and practice, which undermined the conception of liberty that has prevailed until present day. So I'm thinking about liberal voluntarism and the war against nature. So could you describe these revolutions to us with more details to fully understand?
Sure. Well, of course, the word liberty is very ancient. It's a word, it's a Latin word, libertas. It has ancient Greek variants, and it's a very old concept. It's found in the writings of Plato and Aristotle. It's found in the Hebrew Bible. It's found in the Christian Bible. Of course, St. Paul speaks of the freedom one finds in being a follower of Christ, the liberty one finds that one can be set free if one follows Christ. So the language of liberty is very ancient, but the definition of liberty in these ancient writings is quite different than the modern definition of liberty. The ancient description of liberty is the condition of, we could call it a condition of self-rule or self-discipline. It's a condition of especially governing, we could say, the more bestial or lower or the part of our nature that touches on our appetites or our desires. And the opposite condition of liberty was, for the classical authors, was slavery, but not understood as the limitation that was often exerted externally. Of course, that existed, but understood especially as being dominated by our desires. And this was actually, Plato describes this as a condition of both being a tyrant, or the inclination to be a tyrant, to be subject to one's desires, which are infinite, which can never be satisfied, right? Which we know, which can never be satisfied.
What we witness today.
Yeah, exactly, right, yeah. So, I mean, of course, advertising works on this principle, right? Never to be satisfied, right? When you think you have the last iPhone you'll ever buy, you have to buy the next one because it has a new camera. There's always new desires to be stoked. This understanding of liberty, therefore, requires, you could say, an extensive kind of form of social, political, customary organization, because learning to control our desires is difficult, right? It's in some ways it's painful, right? If you've ever had to diet or avoid buying the thing that you really wanted because you didn't have enough money, it's painful to restrain our desires. It requires a kind of discipline to go to the gym rather than to buy the croissant, right? The pain au chocolat, especially. So it's difficult, and you need the kinds of structures, social, political, religious, familial, communal, that reinforce those lessons. Now, if we think about the modern definition of liberty, introduced by such thinkers as Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, and I think certainly adopted in the American tradition, in our founding constitutional tradition, it's the opposite definition of the classical definition. What liberty becomes is it's defined as the ability to pursue your desire with as few obstacles as possible, so that it in some ways you could say it flips the definition to its opposite meaning in pre-modern times. And so all of those, we could say all those structures of politics, of law, that sought to cultivate forms of self-control, all those structures of religion, of culture, family, community, these are not now requirements of liberty, these are obstacles to liberty. These become the major obstacles to my being able to pursue the desires, the appetites, the inclinations that I might wish. So modern liberalism, in some ways you could say, inverts the definition of liberty and then begins to undermine, attack, and eliminate those structures as the obstacles of liberty, redefining, what constitutes like the norms, you could say, the norms of liberal society. So the two ways I describe in my book that you see this especially is the need of liberal human beings to free themselves from other people. And in particular, any relationship that isn't chosen and infinitely revisable. That all relationships have to be our own voluntary decision to enter them, right? So everything from friendship to marriage to religion to where we live, who we live with, and that these are infinitely revisable. So no contract is permanent, except the liberal contract. And thus marriage, for example, goes from being a lifelong commitment to, more often the case today, a series of sort of, a succession of relationships that, reflect a kind of momentary commitment. The second major obstacle is the obstacle of nature, because of course nature limits our freedom. Yeah. And the modern project becomes the conquest of nature, right? Especially through the development of science and technology that seeks to overcome nature. So these two aspects, we could say the political and social project of the liberation of the individual and the technological scientific project of liberating human beings from nature are the two main engines of the liberal order.
In your book, you insist on this opposition between man and nature, and you mentioned Aristotle a few minutes before. We all know this famous quote about him, that man is by nature a social animal. You mentioned this power and domination of human beings on nature, thanks to science, technology, and economic growth. We can see the use of science to overcome natural limitation. And so we see these debates today about transhumanism, our hopes to live indefinitely, extend the human life expectancy. So that's really appealing and relevant.
And really what you see in these developments is the combination of these two strands. So the freedom of the individual becomes linked to or connected to the conquest of nature. So initially, liberalism describes the conquest of nature as the conquest of nature out there, the natural world. So using sort of the resources and the various sort of deposits that nature provides for us, and to utilize those for our own ends and for our own comfort. But ultimately, the project of conquering nature turns inward. It becomes the project of conquering human nature or changing or altering human nature. So the liberation of the individual becomes tied to the technological project, which is why you see, of course, today the sort of frontiers of liberalism really are about the transformation of the human person. And this, of course, isn't just prolonging life and conquering all of the diseases and limitations that are presented to us. But of course, a main feature is of course governing reproduction. It's governing the production of the next generation. And this has been a project, of course, for at least the last 50 years, birth control, abortion, increasingly the creation, right, the ability to manipulate the genetic code of the life. And I think the hope is eventually to really just remove reproduction from the human biology altogether and externalized wombs and ovaries and so forth. Yeah.
So why has the questioning of liberalism become more important than before? What exactly is your take on today's society? What changed?
I mentioned the influence of Alexis de Tocqueville earlier, and Tocqueville's argument is very much influences my own thinking. Tocqueville's argument was, of course, he learned it in part from Plato, so it's a very old argument. And the argument is basically every regime, in a sense, contains its own weaknesses or contains the seeds of its self-destruction. That every political ordering has a kind of a very key imperfection that if sort of left to its own devices, it will eventually undo the nature nature of that regime. So you could say regimes or political orders can be destroyed in really one of two ways: from an external threat, and that of course has certainly happened many times in human history. That tends to be the one that we pay the most attention to. It's the most dramatic. Rome being sacked by the Goths, or the fall of the fall of Nazi Germany or something. These are very pronounced and obvious fall. The way regimes can be defeated. Less obvious because it tends to be slower, and it tends to be a little bit like that image of the frog being boiled in water slowly, where the temperature goes up and the frog doesn't realize it. Is the way that every regime has this kind of critical weakness that over time slowly manifests itself. And really the argument of my book is that this is as true of liberalism as it has been of any political regime, any political order. It's just that it's been relatively slow for us to realize that what we thought of as maybe problems, maybe things that needed reform, actually at a very deep level are critical weaknesses. And so we could mention two just related to what we were talking about. I mean, I could talk about more, but let me just talk about those two. The first would be the vision of the human person that is at the heart of the liberal project is the liberation of the individual. It's the liberation of the individual from any arbitrary relationship that we haven't chosen and infinitely revisable. So this means two things. First of all, you will begin to see all of the pathologies of a society of people who no longer have deep, sort of permanent, meaningful relationships. So a kind of what we certainly see in the United States today, a kind of epidemic of loneliness, of a sense of disconnection, of the inability of people to form long-term relationships. Marriage rates are declining, birth rates are declining. We're seeing the rise of suicides and deaths of despair, reliance upon drugs, alcohol, and so forth. The mortality rates of sort of working class Americans, or let's say the age of mortality, is actually dropping for the first time in modern history. So people are dying younger, not as a result necessarily of medical problems, but because of self-inflicted deaths in particular. So that's one way we see that. And the second way would be of course, what nature is telling us, right? The crisis of our environment, the crisis of the natural order, obviously in things like climate change, but I think also the accelerating use and destruction of resources. In order to fulfill a present generation's desire for freedom, we are willing to mortgage the future generations, their capacity to enjoy the resources of the world. So there's a kind of generational selfishness that we're seeing. And I think it's turning into a kind of generational war. Right now it's a kind of Cold War, but I think it's becoming hotter. I think the sense of betrayal and a sense of being ill-used by younger people, by their elders, is very palpable among my students today.
Defend different cultures and beliefs, protect human dignity, and so on. But what you're describing is kind of the exact opposite. Is this what you mean by the weaknesses of the regime?
Yeah, so the core thesis of the book is that liberalism has failed not because it failed to achieve its ends, it has failed because exactly it has succeeded. Right? That's the irony. It's not that it failed or fell short of its goals, but in achieving its goals, in making us these free, right, autonomous, free-floating individuals in a world in which we increasingly dominate nature, we've created the kind of crisis of liberalism that we're seeing a pushback, we could say, both from the political world as well as the natural world. And these two aspects, I think, are today really gathering, significant force. And I think they really do give us a sense of sort of palpable crisis. I think there's one other aspect which needs to be mentioned, which is as the project of liberalism begins to, as it must, it really begins to seeks to deconstruct the areas of life where it's most difficult or most challenging to create this free, autonomous individual. And in particular, this would be true of the family, right, where we don't get to choose our parents and we don't get to choose who our children are. And it would be true in religion, which is, you're brought up typically in a religious tradition because it's what your family and their parents and their parents, it's a tradition. And furthermore, it requires a kind of recognition that we aren't self-creating, right? That we are creatures and not merely people who create our own selves. These two areas are the areas where I think you see the most absolutely sort of intense political conflict today. Certainly in the United States, I think also in France, the protest, I was there in France several summers ago, the protests against surrogacy. But, in the United States, increasing efforts to control things like homeschooling, whether or not parents have a right to raise their children in a religious tradition. Obviously, these questions about technological relationship to the family, as well as, of course, the relationship of the state and religion. How much can the state control religious institutions, and the kind of battles today in the United States over questions of religious liberty? If we think about it, these are the last two frontiers that liberalism must control to realize its project. But they're also the most resistant, right? They're the hardest, the most challenging areas to achieve its ends. And this is where I think you're seeing, in some ways, the crisis of liberalism, because on the one hand, it suggests that this should just all be a voluntary choice, right? This should all just be something that everyone wants to do as a matter of freedom. But what we're seeing is that a liberal state has to impose its views in these areas. And the revelation, right, the kind of the unshrouding of the force and power of the liberal state in these areas, I think has been a wake-up call to many people who thought that liberalism was about freedom, but increasingly see it as a kind of authoritarian regime.
And you mentioned the state and its power. We had a very important question to ask you about the paradox that you mentioned in your book about statism and individualism, because you even dare to say that the state creates the individual. So can you clarify or explain your statements about this paradox?
Yeah, so again, if we think about this, the idea of the human being that you find in liberal philosophy, we can use the example of John Locke, the British philosopher, who proposes an idea of the state of nature as a way of thinking about how do we understand human beings as in their natural state. You mentioned Aristotle earlier, right? Aristotle believes man is by nature a political or a social animal. That is to say, by nature, we must exist in political settings because that's how we become fully human. Locke, following Hobbes, argues the opposite. Humans are by nature creatures who don't require politics to be human. In fact, we see humans in their essence when they're in the pre-political state, in what he calls the state of nature. And that's where we see human beings as their essential selves, which he says as creatures endowed with rights, who are not limited artificially by laws, by customs, by traditions, by histories, by families, all the things that we might think of as constituting who we are, right? If someone asks you who you are, you'll typically say, I come from here, my parents are this, they do this, these are my friends, this is where I went to school. And what Locke is saying, that's all accidental. The essence of what you are is this free choosing autonomous individual. That's the real nature of what you are. Now, what we know is that these kinds of human beings don't exist actually in nature, right? They don't exist in nature. We have to be born to someone. We're born in a place, and we're born typically learning, or we learn a language, and the language that we learn shapes the way that we think, and the traditions that we pick up through our families and through the places that we grow up. So this creature that's supposed to exist by nature doesn't actually exist by nature. The great French political philosopher Bertrand de Jouvenel. I hope you read de Jouvenel. Great French political thinker. You need to read him. He's largely unknown in the United States. He should be much better known in France. Jouvenel wrote in one of his books that the state of nature theorists were all childless men who forgot their own childhood. They forgot the fact that they were born into relationships and kind of unchosen relationships. So if the aim is to create this form of the individual human being that's supposed to be our nature, it can't be through nature. Right? Nature actually, and say you could argue, creates the opposite. So what makes us into these human beings? You actually need a very extensive apparatus. And this is increasingly taken on by two entities. The state is one, and the state, through its laws, through the ways that encourage us to think about ourselves, increasing our mobility, increasing our sense of that we are, in some ways, we are forms of portable property, and as well as increasing the scope and scale of the market, which is a creation of the state itself. These two entities combine to create the sense of the individual, the sense of this free, autonomous self. But here's where Tocqueville is again quite brilliant. What Tocqueville recognized is that once this individual has been created, this individual comes to rely upon the state. This is his famous conclusion of Democracy in America. The free individual submits to what he calls a new form of democratic despotism. Because all of the kinds of informal intermediary relationships have been weakened or even eliminated, family, community, church, the traditions and customs in which we're a part, we rely increasingly upon the state. So while we might think, or the theory of liberalism suggests that the rise of the individual requires the diminishment of the state, right? The limitation of the state. The reality of liberalism is actually, as the individual increases in its autonomy, the role of the state increases as the caretaker of the individual. And the two combine. Arguably, the more free we become, in theory, the more subject we become to the state. Right? That's the paradox. And I think it describes much of the world we live in today. I think the experience of many Europeans with the European Union, the experience of many Americans with the American government is one of theoretical freedom, but stricter and stricter control over every aspect of life.
That's very true. For liberals, the state has to be limited when it comes to manners and morals. Can you tell us why?
Well, let me see. I think, forgive me if I'm not understanding the question. I think what you're in some ways asking is that, or at least what I argue in my book, is that what we might describe as manners and morals, we could broadly describe it as culture, the practices of culture. In many societies, culture acts as a kind of, as a form of law. It's something Aquinas recognized. When Aquinas speaks of law, and even Aristotle recognizes, he says, custom often acts with more authority than law, like the public law that we think of. Because people, once they've practiced customs, don't spit on the street, open the door for a woman, certain kinds of practices that might once have been common. It's not mandated by law, but we're likely to do it because we imitate the people around us. You just simply do it without thinking, right? Laws, in some ways, you have to know, you have to learn them. But customary practices function as a kind of law. Now, as I was saying earlier, in a liberal world, custom is a kind of restraint upon our freedom, right? It's the world of custom that has to be overturned for us to believe ourselves to be free. The problem is that once you've eliminated custom, what orders our relationships? What orders the sort of our interactions? The more custom recedes as a kind of informal form of ordering, the more law has to fill in. And law has to be largely reactive, especially in a liberal society. So the example I give in my book is, it's prominent on college campuses in the United States today, maybe in France as well. There used to be a lot of customs governing the interactions of men and women. especially at the young age of young adulthood, when passions are very intense, as we might remember. You might remember, I certainly remember them. You might know them better. These passions are extremely intense, and so you need a really thick set of customs to govern that behavior. Courtship practices, right? How a man and a woman interact, the kinds of customs that govern those interactions. And these were very, very thick, and of course were perceived as very restrictive. And these were overturned, 1960s, 1970s. These were overturned in the name of freedom. Now, the result wasn't a paradise. It wasn't utopia. Right? The result was a free-for-all on college campuses, a culture in which men and women didn't know how to interact. So increasingly, to do the things they really wanted to do, which are kind of difficult to do just, without any courtship, they would get really drunk. They would drink a lot. They would lose their sense of self-control. They would engage in all kinds of sexual activity. And then afterwards, there was a question, did I really agree to all of this? Did I consent to this? So increasingly, law had to play the role of saying, we will determine, the state will now determine what constitutes consent. And if you broke that consent, you will be punished after the fact. So it can only react to what are breaches in the sort of liberal forms of liberty. It can't tell you there are certain forms of behavior you should engage in well in advance of anything you might engage in sexually, right? You should cultivate some sense of self-control and self-discipline. Liberalism won't tell you that. It will simply say, we will punish you if you have broken the terms of what liberal freedom constitute. And this is the way in which you could say more and more of society becomes inscribed with the legalization of every aspect of life, right? The kind of positive law having to govern where custom and norms and traditions have been evacuated. So it's not a liberal paradise in some ways. This is one of those areas where the state begins to play more and more of a role in governing, the tiny minutiae of every aspect of life.
And well, because in one of your previous interviews, you said that there's no more virtual Christian ethics inside people. So we have to regulate their activities because it's not coming from within. So that's why the state has to regulate more and more all our activities and behaviors.
Yeah. So this is actually this really important point, which is that I think the classical tradition really emphasized, as I was saying earlier, emphasized the development of what we might think of as an interior freedom. Right? Freedom was something achieved through a kind of a way of thinking about the human soul, and the freedom that we achieve was through a kind of interior organization, if you will, of what ought to govern, and especially our reason ought to govern our passion, our capacity for the higher, aspiration for the higher things, for the higher virtues should govern the lower things, our appetites. This was, of course, you'd say this is the form of interiority that was especially prized in the classical tradition. And this is why for someone like Aristotle, the development of virtue is so much hinges on a combination of both habit and intellect, right? So it's the habits that we learn, but it's also our ability to reflect and be reflective on our habits, especially through what he calls phronesis or prudence, practical wisdom or judgment. When this understanding of freedom is overturned in favor of the free action of bodies, the only limiting way, or the way in which you can limit the free action of bodies, is through external force. And this is why law, positive law, and the role of the state increasingly becomes central to liberalism. So I think it's important to really say why it is that liberalism, it's widely believed that liberalism is a philosophy of limited government. And this is the one thing you'll often hear. Liberalism is all about limited government and rule of law. And in one sense, that's true. It's true in the following sense. What liberalism, the way in which it's limited is that liberalism as a philosophy is forbidden from saying what the good is to its citizens. Right? You can't say in advance, this is what the good life is. This is what you should aspire to be. It's to be limited on that question. But once it sort of opens up the field that people can pursue and be anything that they want, then it's unlimited in two senses. First of all, it's unlimited in creating the realm of freedom, which we talked about, right? So it even has to reorder the family, it has to reorder religion, it has to reorder every aspect of society to create the conditions of freedom. And once it's done that, it's unlimited in its control and patrolling of the body, of these free bodies now that have no internal form of self-governance, that now have to be governed externally. So this limited government becomes the most expansive and most powerful form of government that's ever existed on the face of the earth. It would make, King Louis XIV jealous how extensive the modern liberal government is.
So I'd like to change topics a bit. I'd like to talk about diversity. I don't quite get how liberals idolize diversity while advocating for a standardization of cultures. This is what you call a globalized anti-culture, what we commonly call like the cultural melting pot. There's a paradox, I think. Can you please talk a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, so there's a chapter in my book which is really all about this idea of anti-culture. And I think really this is how one should think about any claims that you might hear in a liberal regime, any claims about multiculturalism or diversity really need to be understood as claims in support of what I call an anti-culture. Right. So earlier we were saying that for people to develop the classical virtues and the classical and Christian understanding of liberty, you need these kinds of, let's say, broad informal practices and habits that have to be developed. And what we were just saying, that the kinds of, forms of custom operate, sort of as a more powerful force in these kinds of societies, more than positive or mandated public law. When, in the process of creating a liberal society, there needs to be a weakening of all cultures, right? There needs to be a weakening to the point of nearly eliminating the governing force, you could say, right? The authoritative force of culture. What needs to happen is that culture needs to be turned into a kind of a fashion or an option, something like a costume you can put on, or a restaurant you can go into and taste a little bit of this culture and a little bit of that culture. It ceases to be a governing or shaping force in the everyday life of the people within that culture. And the way that this is achieved is it's kind of a brilliant co-optation of the language of culture. It begins with the language of course, of toleration, which at its origin is an argument that I believe my belief system is true. I think your system is false, but I won't kill you because of that. We will, we can argue. I will tell you what's false about your belief, right? Think of the word toleration in English. I assume in French, it means the point at which something will bend but not break, right? That's a way of measuring, right? So it's not about infinite flexibility, right? There's a point it will break originally, but it comes increasingly to mean indifference. It comes to increasingly mean non-judgmentalism. I have my opinion, you have your opinion. This, of course, becomes the language of multiculturalism. You have your culture, I have my culture. But notice that once you begin to invoke and insist on this language of multiculturalism, what you're really saying is that your primary identity and allegiance is to multiculturalism, not to your culture. It's to this, let's say, this sort of umbrella of toleration. And so that more than any culture you might have or might have inherited, what you really are is this tolerant individual. It means that you really, in some ways, have abandoned your own culture. And the language of diversity, of course, is really just the further advance of this view. And in fact, maybe it's the most deceptive because, at least in the United States today, we tend to talk about diversity when it comes to ethnic, racial, gender categories. Categories we might say is of a scriptive identity, so that you increase diversity in these forms without ever having to actually speak of or increase or recognize the multiplicity of cultures. Right? So it's a kind of false diversity, and so that it's unmistakable that when these arguments tend to be made and when institutions begin to adopt them, they become more and more monolithic. They become more and more homogenous. They look exactly the same. They speak exactly the same. There is actually no multiculturalism, right? A multicultural society is really diverse. It's got a lot of different ways of life. This really was a mark of the United States in its earlier history. All of the immigrant groups that came into the United States with all of their various customs and traditions. And almost without exception, they've all been more or less eliminated and turned into, holidays. St. Patrick's Day is coming up and everyone will claim to be Irish and will drink beer and wear green hats, but there is no real Irish culture anymore. Most of my extended family no longer practice Catholicism. They're no longer members of the church. That was the identity of what an Irish person was. They have no memory and no customs regarding the Irish traditions. It's all just a very thin patina that's been rendered into a kind of very identical and homogenous form of liberal anti-culture rather than any thick sense of culture.
All right.
And well, there is another important point that we would like to cover is it's about liberalism and the conception of work, because you quote in your book Karl Polanyi and his classic study The Great Transformation, and who explained the fact that there is a people's acceptance that their labor and its products were nothing more than commodities subject to price mechanisms, a transformating ways of considering people and nature alike in newly utilitarian and individualistic terms. So we are witnessing, and in our liberal societies, that a profession is actually no more a vocation or a mission, but it became a simple job. So we are mobile agents, we change occupation several times in our lifetime. So can we say that there is a reification of work amplified by liberal philosophy?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, and I hope that your students, your fellow students, and you are reading Polanyi, who's I think one of the most important thinkers in thinking about the creation of the modern market. If you look at the etymology or the origin of the word job, it actually means peace. That's the origin of the word. It means a peace. Whereas if you think of work in terms of vocation, the language that you invoked, vocation is from the Latin word vocare, which means to be called. Right? It's in German, it's Ruf, right? It's which is also the word for being called, or to speak, or to call out. When one is called, it's in some ways you could say something external to oneself, draws one into what one's work is, and connects one's work to something outside of oneself. But in the understanding, we could say, of the liberal understanding, work is really all just a set of shattered and disconnected pieces. And I think this is really at its heart. You have to go back to an argument you find in John Locke, who in a very important chapter in the second treatise of government, chapter 5 is called Of Property. And there he makes a very critical definition. He says, property is that which we possess, either the things of the world or our own selves, that we dispose of freely and at our own choice and our own will. What's really key in that definition is to define the self as property, right? Which is really quite new, right? This is not something that you would find certainly not in the Christian tradition, nor in the classical tradition. There was no sense of self-ownership, right? We are creatures of God. We belong to God. We don't own ourselves. And I think this definition of the self as property is really transformative, because the individual becomes, in some ways, the most valuable and essential piece of property that we own. And we think about ourselves as property that we work on, property that we improve, an investment, right? The way we talk today, I'm investing in myself. I'm taking classes, right? I'm improving my marketable skills. So when you think about ourselves as property, disconnected from anything else, it's always about improving my own position vis-a-vis other pieces of property, that I'm competing with, that I'm trying to make more valuable. My stock is more valuable than your stock. And a society framed by this understanding will be one in which the way in which we engage in work is really to advance our own, ultimately our own self, our own interest, disconnected from any way we might understand an alternative way of understanding our work. So a different way of understanding work in the language of vocation is to understand first, in the first case, that I'm called because of a responsibility, right? I'm called because of some obligation that I owe, first of all to God, but also by extension to all other human beings. My work is a part of my the social fabric of society, my responsibility to society. To use St. Paul's language, I'm part of a body. I'm not merely an individual body, I'm a part of an entire body. And I do the work in some ways as part of that body. My individual job, like the job of a hand or the job of a foot, is to be a participant in the good of the body as a whole. We detach our work and ourselves, therefore, in the first instance, from our places. And I've taught at some great universities. I've taught at Princeton, I've taught at Georgetown. I teach now at Notre-Dame, founded by French priests. We call it Notre Dame, by the way.
We forget.
And I think the one thing that students are learning more than anything else, I think the one course of study they're taking is how to live anywhere. That's what they're really studying. They're studying chemistry and philosophy and whatever their subject, but the real thing that they're learning is how to live anywhere and how to live nowhere. Right? How to be this person that's sort of disconnected from any particular place or any particular tradition, any particular background. So we're really launching them into this placeless world where their property can be deployed, right? And they speak of themselves and see themselves as these sort of valuable commodities. So I think this is a really transformative understanding, not just, of course, of work, but of the nature of the entire social order, of which work, of course, is a central part and has to be understood as a central part. So, in an interesting way, you talked about the reification of property. This language, I think you find in Marx, to talk about the commodification of property. It's clearly, Marx is brilliant on this stuff, but it's also very conservative in a way too. And this is where Marx is at his conservative best, because it's about alienation and fragmentation and disconnection. And figures like Edmund Burke and Alexis de Tocqueville were as concerned about this tendency of modern economics as were thinkers like Marx and Marx's epigones as well. So I think especially more conservative people, which I consider myself to be, need to be really concerned with these kinds of arguments that have until now been largely left to Marx and Marxists to analyze. And we really need to be engaged in this analysis.
For our final question, what awaits us, in your view, in this post-liberal world where liberalism has succeeded yet failed?
Well, so there's the real possibility that we are in for a very long period of a kind of liberal tyranny. I think that's a real possibility. And we're seeing the form that it's taking. It's a combination of we typically call elites in the sort of main institutions, the most important institutions of the sort of cultural, educational, media world. So universities, schools, the media corporations, journalists, NGOs, Hollywood, entertainment, you name it, all of the kind of the important institutions that especially are populated by the kind of intellectual elite, graduates of significant or important universities and institutions, congregating especially in urban areas, and increasingly combining with what we're calling increasingly woke capitalism, right? The corporations, especially in the new technologies, that are engaging in really extensive forms of surveillance, of data collection. So you have this kind of, on the one hand, this growing form of liberal tyranny combined with the technological means of actually enforcing it, the kind of the society of cancellation. It's new forms of ostracism or banishment, not now literally from one city, but in a powerful way, from certain kinds of jobs or certain kinds of economic activity. So this is a real possibility, and I think this is one that we have to be quite prepared to confront and to live under. On the other hand, I think that there is a growing awareness of the need to combat this, which doesn't appeal to sort of liberal tradition, doesn't see within liberalism the tools to combat this new form of liberal tyranny. And I think it is a kind of developing worldview. Some people are calling it a kind of post-liberalism, but we could say that it eschews or rejects aspects of liberalism that we've talked about here today. It rejects the idea that a society can claim to be indifferent to a conception of the good, that every society has a conception of the good, and it's a question of what that is and what that's going to be. It denies that there's any such thing as a free market. I think that's always been a fiction. It's been a useful fiction for classical liberalism, but it says that a market should serve certain ends, and those ends aren't merely the sort of pooling of prosperity for some people, but the benefits of an economic order that benefit especially ordinary people who have to sort of carve out and shape decent lives in a challenging world, especially forming families, forming communities, making life livable, where for many today, the option of suicide is preferable to continuing to live. Being quite frank and being quite adamant that among those goods that we seek to support are the goods of human connection. Above all, the family, that first society, the first society that forms us, and without which we know human beings do not flourish. But a family can't exist in an island unto itself. It needs to be combined in a neighborhood of families and in a community of families. And it needs the support of institutions, ranging from civic institutions to church institutions to neighborhood institutions, the range of kinds of organizations, again, that support the flourishing kind of life. And that the state, to the extent that the state has the ability to do so, the state can be supportive of these ends and purposes. The state is not neutral. It's not neutral in a liberal society. It is actually hostile to these forms of organization. As we've seen, it has destroyed these forms of organization. So rather than claim neutrality as our principle, we should claim a concept of the good. And the concept of the good is fundamentally relational and seeks to support an economy that supports these forms of relationality. This, to me, is a kind of post-liberal future. In some senses, it's revolutionary because it says it denies that there's a neutrality. It denies that the state can be indifferent to ends of human flourishing. But in another sense, it's very old. Right? So you find it in Aristotle. You find it in the Christian tradition. It's not reinventing the wheel. It's just rediscovering for a new time a very old form of wisdom that needs a new articulation.
I'd like to say that I was really happy to interview you because reading your book was very interesting. Everything you say, you make it seem obvious for the reader.
Mm-hmm.
And
thank you very much because yes, it was really interesting. And thank you for taking so much.
Clearly, the translation was better than my own writing.
Yeah, true. Well, but thank you very much for taking some of your time to answer our questions. It was very kind of you, and it was a great pleasure for us.
For us both.
My pleasure too. I hope sometime I can come out and visit you there in
Yeah.
Lyon.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
That would be awesome.
And you will be very welcome. Merci, Monsieur Deneen. Je le rappelle, son livre s'appelle « Pourquoi le libéralisme a échoué ?» Une analyse vraiment pertinente de nos sociétés actuelles. Merci à vous de nous avoir suivis. N'hésitez pas à vous abonner à nos différents réseaux sociaux de l'ICEP pour être informé de l'actualité de notre média étudiant. Et à très bientôt pour une nouvelle émission.
Au revoir.
Have a lovely day. Thank you.
Merci. Au revoir.